So, hi, I'm Chris Dragon from Dracoventions, and I'm going to be talking about our FMDiSC family of FileMaker plugins, as well as some information about plugin development. First, I'll cover my history in brief. Then I'll cover plugin development and resources. I'll do a demo of our developer assistant plugin, a preview of Macintosh Industry Printer plugin, Dialog Master plugin, and additional plugins if there's time. This was my first computer, an Apple IIe, double disk drives for copying between floppies because it had no hard drive. I wrote my first program on this computer when I was 8 years old. It looked a little bit like this. It was demonstrating the tower puzzle, how to solve it, and I lost the source code. It was on an old floppy somewhere. I couldn't get an actual screenshot. This was my first Windows PC. It was a 286. And I taught myself C++ from a tutorial I found on an old dial-up bulletin board system. And I spent a lot of my time outside of class programming on this computer. I liked working on my own bulletin board system. This is the program I used and a bit of source code from it. I would add features that my users would use. They would dial in one person at a time, and they would type my parents' phone line, and they were doing stuff on the bulletin board. Way back then, things were difficult. There was no internet. There was no Google. I didn't know any programmers in school, and I had only a few books that I could afford. So I couldn't find, let's see, it's kind of like being an explorer or a detective, and it's really great when you figure things out on your own and you find new solutions. It's a great feeling. So my company name, Dracoventions, refers to invention. Refers to inventing software, which I've always loved doing. Before I got access to the internet, I developed my own terminal program, which works through dial-up under DOS. And it had text and graphics support, kind of like a web browser, which hadn't been invented yet. At my first job at College Club, the company founder had used a database known as PIC because it was what he learned in school. And PIC was used on some of the first space shuttle missions, but it wasn't, it didn't have internet connectivity. So I had to invent a way to make PIC talk to the company website in order to get the first website up for the company. Our website grew, and I invented a way to put email, voicemail through the website as part of your email box. And I invented a way to play email through voicemail. They also had a voicemail system. I worked on the chat system and the matchmaking system, amongst other things. So about plugin programming, let's see. Page 2. Plugin development reminds me of my early days as a detective because when I started my plugin development about 5 years ago, there was you could only get the SDK off the FileMaker Advanced CD, and so few people had access to it, few people knew it. The only documentation FileMaker provides only talks about how to install plugins on the client and the server. It doesn't talk about plugin development itself. It talks about how to auto-install plugins from FM server to FM client. You can get the plugin SDK these days off FileMaker's website, so it's no longer limited to buying FileMaker Pro Advanced. And that's, it contains limited information in the header file comments, which is part of how I got started. Third parties have had to come in and rescue us as far as documentation. You can Google for a FileMaker plugin dev mailing list, and you will get the FileMaker developer mailing list. You can find plugin wikis started by IDMA software. This resource I think appeared about 2 years ago, but neither of these things were known to me when I started my development. So I started with a sample plugin on the older FileMaker Advanced CDs, and I don't think that's included anymore in FileMaker 11. Instead, the FileMaker website now points you to a third-party plugin sample from cheap-for-use software, which is actually a lot better than FileMaker's original plugin. It has better comments and more helpful information. So just last Wednesday, Base Elements Goya was released as an open source plugin. I think it's the first open source plugin of its kind, and you can download that and get started. And add to it if you want. Who should write plugins? If you know Objective-C for Mac or C++ for Windows, using the resources on the previous slide, you should be able to get your own plugin started fairly easily. If you don't already know those languages, I wouldn't recommend starting, but if you know Java, you can use 360works. Script Master plugin is a free plugin that lets you run any Java code you want. And that's a great way for people to get started with plugin-like custom code functionality. PHP coders can use a program called SmartKill from Scodiva. And even Lisp coders can use this project on SourceForge. You can also run shell scripts written in Perl and Bash and Windows bat files. The Base Elements plugin has an execute shell script command in it, so that's a free way of using a plugin. On OS X, you can run AppleScript directly from FileMaker scripts without a plugin, and this URL describes how to do it. The shell scripts the AppleScript will call the shell script. On Windows, you don't have AppleScripts, so we have this convoluted way of basically having FileMaker write out a VB script, run it, and then return the results in a web viewer, and that's this URL. If there are any questions, you can answer. Let's see. So when to use plugins? All the time. Or at least when it's impossible or time-consuming to do without them. I've heard a lot of people say they don't use plugins because they might crash or they might cause problems. I've dealt with other plugin companies who have not responded to my emails or have given me vague responses. So I try very hard with my customers to respond quickly and give good answers and fix the problems.
Do you get a lot of good feedback?
Yeah, now that I'm doing the Macintosh plugins, I'm seeing a lot more interest than when I was doing Windows, so I'm getting a lot more feedback these days. It is hard to get people to report bugs, though. A lot of times they'll just give up and not tell me about it.
Yeah.
That's too bad, because then other people encounter the same bug and I hear very much later. So some plugins, like the Developer Assistant plugin, are only used during plugin development, so they won't affect your customers. Other plugins can be included in the FileMaker runtime generated by FileMaker Pro Advanced. So you include the plugin and your database and create a runtime solution that you give to your customers, and they don't need to buy FileMaker. And you can also tell FileMaker Servant to install plugins on the FileMaker clients that connect to the server. This is how I discovered FileMaker. I wanted to work for an environmental company. So I was happy to get a job at the Children's Nature Institute in 2004, and they happened to be using FileMaker. In fact, they've been using it for 15 or 20 years, and I had to clean up all that unplanned database development that they didn't really know what they were doing.
Had you even heard of FileMaker before that?
Ironically, I didn't think about it at the time, but I later realized that I worked with it when I volunteered for the Children's Nature Institute when I was pretty young. My mom has been working with them for ages. So I went and did some data entry on like FileMaker 3 or something. But I didn't remember the name of it, so it was kind of like discovering new software when I joined. After a couple more years, I realized that there were some things that FileMaker couldn't do, so I wanted to write my own plugin to do those things myself. And I probably should have bought plugins to do it, but I do like inventing. So my plugin at the time could do some things that other plugins around here couldn't, especially the Developer Assistant. I share those features with the world. As a Windows-only plugin, which is how it started, the interest was minimal, and it's partly, let's see. So I learned Objective-C, and I learned how to program on Mac, and began porting it to Mac.
How big are the differences between C++ and Objective-C? I mean, they're based on the same core.
Right. Objective-C is kind of like a wrapper around or an extension of C++. So you use a lot of C++, but you also have things like Cocoa that are pure Objective-C. And the syntax is fairly different, but it's similar enough that it's not too hard to wrap your head around. And yes, Mac is a pure Cocoa. People have asked me. So developer assistant, the Mac version was released about 6 months ago in October. The Windows version was released in 2008, so almost 3 years ago. The Windows version only saw moderate interest, and it's because of that, and because I was worried about FileMaker 11 making the plugin obsolete, which it didn't really have anything. But I put off doing the Mac version until now, which I'm sorry for because the Mac version has taken off like wildfire. Apparently there's a lot more Mac users than Windows users.
That's not correct, and that's what's strange about that. You say the Windows version didn't draw much attention, it was released in 2008. Who had heard of it?
Maybe it was
And
just like
and I
marketing.
don't mean that as a criticism
Right.
of you, but about 60 to 65% of the install base of FileMaker is Windows.
Right. But what about the developer?
It's hard to say. The independent developer community tends towards Mac.
Right.
The in-house developer community is heavily.
That's my background.
At pause on error, there was one of the sessions where there was probably about 40 people in the room and 38 of them were Mac users.
There was actually one hand that went up and said he was a Windows developer, only because the majority of his clients were Windows, doesn't have a Mac.
Right. So I think there's a lot of Windows clients, but probably not quite as many developers.
People getting,
But yes, it is. But the question here is when the Windows version was released, I don't remember hearing about it. Now, you know, I'm at the age now where the things I remember most clearly never actually happened. But I'm sorry, I just don't remember.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if suddenly people are paying attention.
Well, I think sometimes it just has to get in front of the right people, and then, you know, they're the kind of people who evangelize something they like and buy it. And it's
Well,
about,
there's clearly a critical mass, a tipping point, and all that, and you may be at the tipping point. You may see your Windows sales start to go up